Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
All right, well, today we're going deep into the world of psychedelics, secrets, and a guy they call the LSD King.
Oh, this is going to be good.
It is. We're diving into the life of William Leonard Pickard.
I've heard the name.
Oh, yeah, you've definitely heard the name, especially if you're into the whole, psychedelic world.
Right.
Our main source here is White Rabbit, a book all about Pickard.
I'm ready to go down this rabbit hole.
Me too.
Yeah.
So the book starts with Pickard's childhood, and right away you get this sense of like a larger-than-life personality. But there's a catch. There are all these different stories about his early years.
Different stories from who?
Well, Pickard himself says he grew up in Georgia after World War II, had a scientist stepmother who got him totally fascinated by biology. He even tells these stories about hanging out at the CDC as a kid, like mesmerized by irradiated fruit flies and all this crazy lab equipment.
I can see the appeal for a certain type of kid.
Totally.
Yeah.
But then you hear from his relatives, and they paint a completely different picture.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they say he grew up in the city, more of a bookworm than a science whiz kid.
So, which is it?
That's it's hard to say for sure. It's almost like Pickard is, maybe embellishing his past a bit. This whole truth versus myth thing becomes a theme throughout the book.
Intriguing.
It is. And this tendency to, maybe bend the truth a little, it follows him to Princeton.
Princeton. Fancy.
Right. Pickard says he witnessed this big protest against Madame New, who was the sister-in-law of South Vietnam's president at the time.
Wow.
He describes this whole dramatic scene with a student pretending to set himself on fire, and even the marching band playing Smoke Gets in Your Eyes.
That's a pretty vivid image.
It is. And it shows how Pickard was already kind of anti-establishment back then, even at a place like Princeton.
So already kind of a rebel.
Yeah, definitely a rebel. But even with all his brains, he still gets into trouble. Arrests for forgery, stealing a car.
He sounds like he was a handful.
You could say that. It's like he can't resist pushing the limits, seeing what he can get away with.
Testing those boundaries.
Exactly. But then, in Chapter 2, we get to a really pivotal moment. Pickard's first experience with LSD.
Where does this happen?
At the Institute of Living, which was a mental hospital.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. The book makes this connection between Pickard's first trip and Bicycle Day.
Wait, refresh my memory. Bicycle Day.
Bicycle Day is the anniversary of the day. Albert Hofmann, the chemist who first synthesized LSD, accidentally took some and went on his famous bike ride.
Oh, yeah, right.
But here's the thing. Hofmann kind of saw LSD as his problem child. Something to be careful with. But Pickard, he's drawn to LSD's potential for, disruption. Its power to shake things up.
Two very different perspectives.
Right. And from those early encounters, you can almost see Pickard's path starting to form.
Oh.
But then Chapter 3 shifts gears and takes us back in time to the history of LSD itself.
So we're getting some context.
Exactly. And it's important context because it helps us understand the world Pickard is operating in.
Makes sense.
So we learned about the CIA's MKUltra program. These were top-secret experiments with LSD.
Didn't those go pretty badly?
Yeah, some of them were really messed up. The book talks about Frank Olson, a CIA scientist who died in a really suspicious fall from a hotel window after he was given LSD without his knowledge.
Yeah, that's a dark story.
It really is. It makes you think about the ethics of these experiments and the whole idea of the government messing around with psychedelics in secret.
Definitely raises some red flags.
Big time. But then we meet some of the major players in the counterculture movement.
Oh, like who?
Well, there's Timothy Leary, of course.
Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Exactly. And then there's Ken Kesey and his whole Merry Prankster scene.
The electric Kool-Aid acid test.
That's the one. And then, of course, you got Augustus Owsley Stanley III, better known as just Owsley.
The Grateful Dead's sound man and chemist, right?
That's him. The guy who pretty much supplied LSD to a whole generation.
Yeah.
The book even describes some of those famous Owsley batches like they were fine wines, Purple Dragon, and White Lightning.
It's crazy to think about how LSD went from a research chemical to this cultural phenomenon so fast.
It really is. It was like the fuel for this whole countercultural revolution.
Yeah.
And then Chapter 4 brings us back to Pickard, who's now drawn to California, the epicenter of it all.
California, the land of sunshine and psychedelics.
Pretty much. He starts working at UC Berkeley, at their Department of Bacteriology and Immunology.
Right in the thick of things.
Totally. And at Berkeley, he meets Nick Sand and Tim Scully, who created Orange Sunshine, LSD.
Orange Sunshine, that's another one for the history book.
Oh, yeah. and they founded the Brotherhood of Eternal Love.
The Brotherhood. I vaguely remember something about them. Weren't they all about, like, LSD as a path to peace and enlightenment?
Exactly. Their goal was to make and distribute LSD on a huge scale, but they wanted to do it in a peaceful, almost utopian way.
Sounds idealistic.
It was. And they were incredibly successful for a while. But then as we get into Chapter 5, things start to fall apart.
What happened?
Well, the government started cracking down hard on LSD, Owsley gets arrested, and the Brotherhood eventually collapses.
The end of an era.
Yeah, kind of like the walls were closing in on this psychedelic utopia.
So what happens to Pickard?
Well, this is a turning point for him. He goes underground, operating in total secrecy, learning from the mistakes of the guys who came before him.
So he becomes even more cautious.
Way more cautious. The book even mentions this idea of the Six. Pickard claims it was a secret group of LSD chemists, and he was one of them.
A secret society of psychedelic scientists?
Something like that. He wrote a book called The Rose of Paracelsus
Yeah.
that hints at their existence, but never reveals their identities.
That's pretty wild.
It is. And all this secrecy starts to take its toll on Pickard. More legal trouble, another drug arrest, a probation violation.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and he ends up back in California.
So back to the scene of the crime, kind of.
You could say that. But this time, he meets someone who's the total opposite of his secretive world.
Who's that?
Alexander Shulgin.
Shulgin, the godfather of psychedelics.
That's the one. A brilliant chemist who created hundreds of psychedelic compounds.
Mm.
But here's the thing. Unlike Pickard, Shulgin actually cooperated with the DEA. Even wrote a guidebook for them on psychedelics.
Two completely different approaches.
Totally. Pickard, the secretive outlaw chemist, and Shulgin, the respected researcher working within the system. It's almost like they represent two sides of the same coin.
I can see that. So what happens next?
Well, despite their differences, they formed a bond. Shulgin mentored Pickard, and Pickard even started going to these Friday night dinners at Shulgin's house.
Friday night dinners with the psychedelic elite.
Exactly. But even with this new connection, Pickard is still drawn to that world of secrecy and risk.
So what happens next? This is getting good. I'm hooked. What happens to Pickard next?
So Chapter 6 takes us to kind of a turning point in Pickard's life.
Yes.
His dad and stepmom both die.
Oh, wow. That's tough.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And the book suggests that, maybe this makes him rethink his life a little.
Uh-huh.
He ends up back in California again, enrolls at Stanford. It seems like he's trying for a fresh start.
Back to school.
Yeah. But even with this whole academic thing going on, he just can't seem to stay away from psychedelics.
The pull is too strong.
Yeah, exactly. He reconnects with Shulgin and starts going to those Friday night dinners again.
Those dinners sound legendary.
They do, right? Like a secret society of intellectuals exploring the edges of consciousness.
I'd love to have been a fly on the wall.
Me too. But then, Chapter 7 slams us back into Pickard's world of risk and secrecy.
What happens?
He gets busted again in 1988,
Busted for what?
running a huge LSD lab.
He can't stay out of trouble.
Nope. And this time, he tries a new tactic, calls it Ivy Mike.
Mighty Mike. What's that?
Basically a vow of silence. He doesn't say a word to the cops.
Risky.
Super risky, but it actually works. He avoids any serious consequences.
So he gets off scot-free.
Pretty much. Makes you wonder if that just encouraged him to keep pushing his luck.
Makes sense. If you get away with something once.
Right. And around this same time, he meets this mysterious dude called DMT-47.
DMT-47. That's an interesting name.
Right. Well, this guy introduces Pickard to the global drug trade.
Oh, so it's getting even bigger now.
Much bigger. And what's really strange is that while he's diving deeper into the world of psychedelics, he also gets super interested in fentanyl.
Fentanyl. As in the super dangerous opioid.
The one and only.
That's kind of a weird mix, exploring consciousness and getting involved with hard drugs.
It is, right. It's like this weird duality in his personality, drawn to both the light and the darkness.
I see what you mean.
And then things take another turn in Chapter 8. Pickard ends up in prison.
Prison? What happened?
Well, despite all his smarts and connections, he couldn't outrun the law forever. He ends up at Terminal Island.
So what's it like for him on the inside?
Well, the book talks about how he finds some solace in Buddhist teachings. Lots of meditation, exploring the ideas of people like Alan Watts.
So finding some inner peace in a pretty chaotic environment.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, was this a real search for redemption or just a way to cope with prison life?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
It really is. And then Chapter 9 throws us another curveball. Pickard gets out of prison and becomes a Buddhist monk.
You're kidding. A monk.
No kidding. Spends 2 years at the Zen Center in San Francisco, then goes to Tasajara, this super remote monastery.
Wow. Talk about a life change.
I know, right? It's like he was trying to reinvent himself completely.
But did he really leave his old life behind?
That's the thing. Even as a monk, he still hangs out with Shulgin and goes to these gatherings hosted by John Weir Perry, a psychologist who was also into psychedelics.
It seems like that world just keeps pulling him back in.
It does. And Chapter 10 really highlights this tension when he decides to go back to school.
Back to school again. At his age.
Yeah. And not just any school. He enrolls at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government.
The LSD king at Harvard. That's crazy.
It is, right? And to top it off, he gets a research fellowship at Harvard Medical School to study addiction.
So trying to bridge the gap between his past and this new legitimate world.
Maybe. It's like he wants to use what he's learned, all that underground knowledge, to contribute to mainstream science. But is it a genuine change of heart, or just another chapter in this really complex, contradictory life?
I guess we'll have to keep going to find out. So Pickard's at Harvard studying addiction. It seems like he's finally gone straight.
You'd think so, right? But then, Chapter 11 throws us for a loop.
What happens? Don't leave me hanging.
Pickard gets sucked back into the LSD world.
No way. He can't resist, can he?
It's like this magnetic pull, he can't escape it. He gets back in touch with DMT-47, the guy from before.
The one who introduced him to the global drug scene.
That's the one. And then he teams up with this guy named Todd Skinner, young guy, super charismatic, claimed to have inherited a ton of money.
Sounds a little too good to be true.
Oh, it is. Together, Pickard and Skinner come up with this crazy plan to make LSD on a massive scale.
Bigger than ever before.
Oh, yeah. They even recruit this whole team. John Halpern, a Harvard psychiatrist, Stefan Wathney, an investor, even Clyde Apperson, a guy Pickard's known for years.
Pickard's building a whole new crew.
It's like a new brotherhood, but way more secretive and sophisticated.
So what's the plan? Where do they set up shop?
Chapter 12 takes us inside their operation, which they call the swimming pool. And get this, they set up their lab in an old missile silo.
A missile silo? You've got to be kidding. Seriously.
Dead serious. Out in Kansas somewhere, the whole thing is straight out of a spy movie.
That's insane. So they're like cooking up LSD in this underground bunker. What are they, supervillains?
It kind of feels that way, right? All this cutting-edge equipment, new techniques for making LSD, and the paranoia. Off the charts. They're obsessed with secrecy.
But it can't last forever, right?
Yeah.
All that pressure, all those moving parts, something's got to give.
You're right. And that's where it all starts to unravel. Chapter 13 lays it out. Skinner, the charismatic partner, turns out he's not who he says he is. Total con man, addicted to drugs, manipulative, liar, the whole 9 yards.
So Pickard got played.
Big time. And here's the kicker. Skinner's been working with the DEA the whole time.
Whoa. He's an informant.
Yep. He's the DEA's inside man, the key to bringing the whole operation down.
That's a brutal betrayal.
It is. And it all goes down on Election Day in 2000. The DEA raids the silo and arrests Pickard and Apperson.
What a way to end the millennium.
Talk about bad timing, right?
Yeah.
So Pickard's in deep, betrayed by his partner. And the media, they're painting him as some criminal mastermind.
So what happens to Skinner? Does he get away with it?
Chapter 14 is all about the aftermath. And guess what? Skinner doesn't exactly ride off into the sunset.
What do you mean?
He keeps doing shady stuff, gets mixed up in some really bad things, even a suspicious death that the police are looking into. It's like he can't escape his own demons.
Wow. So this whole thing is falling apart, and now Pickard's facing some serious charges.
Yep. Chapter 15 focuses on the legal battle. Pickard keeps his mouth shut, sticks to his Ivy Mike strategy. His lawyer, a guy named Billy Rourke, he's fighting hard, but it's a tough case.
I bet. But didn't we talk about something being off about the amount of LSD they said they seized?
Oh, yeah, that's a big part of it. At first, the DEA claims they got like 91 pounds of LSD.
Oh,
enough to dose the entire Western Hemisphere, or so they say.
That's an insane amount.
It is, right?
Yeah.
But then, during the trial, it comes out that they actually only found about half a pound.
Wait, what? That's a huge difference.
It is. Makes you wonder if the DEA was exaggerating to make Pickard look worse and justify the bust.
That's messed up.
It is. But even with all that, the jury still finds Pickard guilty.
No. After all that, he still gets convicted. What was the sentence?
Chapter 16, The Moment of Truth. The judge, a guy named Richard Rogers, known for being super tough on drug cases, well, he sentences Pickard to 2 life terms.
2 life terms? That seems way too harsh.
It does, especially with all the questions about how much LSD was really involved. But that's the reality. Pickard's going to prison for a very long time.
So that's it. The LSD king spends the rest of his life behind bars. What's prison like for him?
Well, Chapter 17 paints a pretty bleak picture. He bounces around at different prisons, sees a lot of violence, experiences the harshness of the system firsthand.
I can only imagine. But even in prison, he doesn't stop learning, does he?
Not at all. He keeps writing, reflecting, studying psychedelics and drug policy. It's like this unquenchable thirst for knowledge, even in the worst possible environment.
That's pretty amazing. What about the rest of his crew? Halpern, Wathney, Apperson.
Chapter 18 catches us up with them. Halpern loses his medical license but manages to avoid jail time. Wathney, he loses everything, financially ruined.
And Apperson.
He does a few years and then gets out.
Wow. So this whole thing really blew up in their faces.
It did. It's like a cautionary tale, right? This big plan to spread LSD, it ends in betrayal, ruin, and prison.
What a mess. So what about Pickard? Is that really it for him? 2 life sentences, no chance of ever getting out.
Well, hang on, because the story isn't over yet. Chapter 19 is a real game changer. Remember that file on Skinner, the informant? The one the court sealed?
Yeah, what about it?
Well, after years of fighting, Pickard's lawyers finally get a judge to unseal it. And what's inside is shocking. Turns out, Skinner was a really unreliable informant, a total manipulator who lied to the DEA and even made up evidence.
Are you serious? So the whole case against Pickard was built on lies?
Pretty much. It throws everything into question.
Does this mean Pickard gets a new trial?
Sadly, no. But the revelations about Skinner really damaged the case against him.
So what happens? Does he stay in prison forever?
Hold on to your hats. Because after 16 years behind bars, in 2017, Pickard gets released from prison.
He gets out. I can't believe it. After all that, what does he do?
Chapter 20 is all about his life after prison. He reconnects with his family, starts advocating for changes to drug laws, and guess what? He still believes in the power of psychedelics.
Wow, that's remarkable. After everything he's been through, he hasn't given up hope.
It really is something. His resilience is pretty incredible. But it makes you wonder, what's his legacy? What will people remember him for?
That's the question we're left with in Chapter 21, the LSD King, a brilliant scientist, a rebel, a criminal. His story makes you think about the war on drugs, the ethics of research, the good and the bad of psychedelics.
Pickard's story is a wild ride, full of contradictions and unexpected turns. But one thing's for sure, it makes you think.
It really does. Makes you question everything you thought you knew about drugs, about the justice system, about what's possible.
It's been an amazing journey, exploring this hidden world with you.
It really has. Pickard's life is a reminder that the human spirit can endure almost anything. It's a story about the power of belief, the search for knowledge, and the complexities of human nature.
And to our listeners, we hope you'll keep exploring these questions too. Pickard's story is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new and fascinating world. Thanks for listening.